Welcome, everyone. We will be using a few polls today to gather your feedback. If you see one pop up on your screen, please take a moment to submit your answer. My name is Sarah Meyer, and I am a member of the HEAL Data Stewardship Group. Thank you all for joining us today for the third installment in our Fresh Fair tutorial series, Where to Share, Using the Right Repository for Your HEAL Data. Today's tutorial will provide guidance on verifying and depositing data into the right repository for your HEAL data. Our tutorial session will begin with a presentation from HEAL Steward Allie Gartland-Gray, walking participants through how and when to decide on a HEAL compliant repository, followed by lightning talks from HEAL investigators Dr. Jonathan Greenberg and Valerie Bradley, sharing their experience with repository selection and data deposition. Following these presentations, we will have 2 breakout rooms where you can dive into repository questions with subject matter experts. The tutorial will conclude after the breakout sessions. Please note that the first part of the tutorial will be recorded and will be shared with all registrants. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We are joined today by our 3 presenters. Allie Gartland-Gray is a research data analyst in the Research Computing Division at RTI International. She has experience in data collection, management, and storage, and has 6 years of experience working in the field of health informatics in a combination of both academic and professional settings. Her educational background is in biology and biomedical health and informatics, and she leverages this knowledge as a HEAL steward to help develop tools and guidance for research data governance, curation, and deposition. Dr. Jonathan Greenberg is a research staff psychologist in the Center for Health Outcomes and Interdisciplinary Research at Massachusetts General Hospital and is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. His research primarily focuses on developing and testing mind-body and mindfulness-based interventions for various clinical populations, with an emphasis on chronic musculoskeletal pain, orofacial pain, and mild traumatic brain injury. Valerie Bradley is a second-year doctoral student in the clinical psychology program at the University of Maryland College Park. In 2019, Valerie earned her master's degree in clinical psychological science and began her current role as the project director of the NIH HEAL Initiative HEAL Together study, led by Dr. Jessica F. Magnuson. Valerie's research centers on enhancing access to evidence-based care in resource-limited settings and exploring person-centered perspectives in addiction treatment to help improve treatment outcomes. At this time, I will pass the presentation over to Allie Gartland-Gray. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to take us through our objectives for today. First, I want to acknowledge that we know that there are a really wide range of HEAL studies. So some studies were awarded under the 2003 NIH data sharing policy, and some studies have been awarded under the new 2023 policy, which says that investigators should choose a repository when writing their data management and sharing plans, or their DMSPs. Our objective for today is to help both categories of investigators in either selecting an appropriate repository for the first time or ensuring that the repository chosen in the DMSP is in fact a suitable choice for your study. We will do this by reviewing the NIH and HEAL data sharing requirements, providing an overview of HEAL compliant repositories, and highlighting criteria and resources for selecting repositories. So first up is the minimum data sharing requirement. Data must be shared in a HEAL compliant repository at the time of publication or at the end of the period of performance, whichever comes first. And HEAL initiative support should be acknowledged in all publications by using the statement that's bolded here on the slide in pink. And then you should also report your research publications to the email address at the bottom of the slide. In terms of what data to share and how much, the minimum requirement is to share all data underlying a publication. Of course, we encourage researchers to share as much data as possible, but we recognize that that's not always feasible. So now we can talk a little bit about where to share data. As I mentioned earlier, NIH's 2023 data management and sharing policy states that investigators should select a suitable repository when writing their DMSPs. And investigators can also budget for the associated costs when they're writing their DMSPs as well. And the allowable costs include local data management considerations, data and metadata curation, and fees associated with sharing data in established repositories. And then as for investigators that were awarded before the 2023 policy, ideally those investigators should be selecting a repository as soon as possible. So whether you're here because you haven't selected a repository yet, or because you want to confirm that the repository you selected already is a good fit for your study, we can help. There are currently 26 repositories on our HEAL compliant list, and all of these repositories were evaluated and selected based on our HEAL repository selection principles. On our website on healdatafair.org. And if you hover over each of those columns, you'll see 3 little dots. And those 3 little dots, you can click on them to access a filter feature. So you can then filter through the descriptive tag column, the organism column, and the IC/program columns. So for example, I could filter the descriptive tags for the keyword generalist. And from there, I would see a list of HEAL compliant generalist repositories, i.e. repositories that don't restrict submission based on data type or format. And another cool way to find a suitable repository is by using the repository selection tool that's also on the website. And this tool essentially just asks a series of questions to help guide you to an appropriate repository. And you can restart the tool as many times as needed using the back or the start over buttons at the bottom of the tool, if in case you're considering using multiple repositories or if you just want to play around and see your options. And with that, I will hand it over to Jonathan to talk about his experience using a repository.
All right, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk a little bit about our study and our process of selecting a database, our experiences with the database, some user experience nuggets. Next slide, please. So this is our study. I'm co-investigator on the study. It's called Addressing the Chronic Pain Epidemic Among Older Adults in Underserved Community Setting, the Get Active Plus study. This is NIA and NINDS funded. All right, next slide, please. So a little bit of background on what kind of study this is and what we're aiming to, the problem that we're aiming to solve. The problem is that older adult and community health centers have less access to treatment. They have poorer prognoses with regard to chronic pain. And the solution that we're aiming for is really implementing an evidence-based mind-body activity program within the clinic. So it's inside this underserved clinic, where this is an intervention development study. So we're really tailoring the intervention to the specific needs of this population. The aim is for it to be delivered by providers in the clinic within billable group visits. The billable group visits is super important to make this treatment more accessible and more affordable because it's billable to insurance. Next slide, please. So this is an R61, R33 study, meaning that it has 2 phases. The R61 phase is kind of like a pilot phase. We just completed it. So we had qualitative data. We had focus groups with patients with chronic pain that are older adults in this clinic. We had interviews with providers. Then we had an open pilot of this program with older adults with chronic pain at this clinic with a pre-post assessment of various measures. And now we're starting the R33 phase, which is a 3-year-long effectiveness implementation trial in which you're going to be randomizing 200 people to our Get Active program versus treatment as usual. Next slide, please. So what kind of data are we collecting? Number one is qualitative data, right? We're interviewing patients, we're interviewing providers, we're asking them about their needs, their challenges, how to best fit their needs. We have some quantitative self-report questionnaires. So measures of anxiety, measures of depression, measures of physical function, a bunch of questionnaires. And we also have some non-self-reported physical function data. Like we measure how many meters they walk within 6 minutes. That's called the 6-minute walk test. And we also measure their daily step count. So they receive actigraph watches, they wear it on their wrist for a week, and we measure how many steps they take. Next slide, please. All right, this is really the meat of the presentation. This is like, okay, so what was our experience and what kind of questions did we have and what sort of challenges did we face? Number one, which database to use? We had no idea. But the HEAL Stewards team was so helpful. We didn't even have to ask them. They just emailed us, hey guys, you have this R61 project. Do you need help with selecting a database? Let's meet over Zoom. And we're like, sure, let's meet over Zoom. And 2 weeks later, we met with like 5 or 6 different people. I'm like, wow, these people are so helpful. They have so many resources available. And we described the study, just like I did now in the couple of slides that I showed. And they're like, oh, you should go with Vivli. Vivli is an awesome database that has mixed methods, and it's good for qualitative and quantitative data, and it's good for pilot studies. And we're like, great, that's what we'll do. End of question. That was super helpful. We had no idea which repositories were available, which ones to use. They recommended one, we went with it. That's awesome. Next one. There were some discrepancies between the data steward's template. So the data steward said, okay, great, you chose Vivli. Here's like how you can structure the data. So they recommended one thing, but we also, through another HEAL data, the CDE, the common data elements, they had something a little bit different. We weren't sure how to resolve these differences. We just went with what the HEAL stewards suggested. We saw them as the experts. That's how they recommended things. We just follow that. That was the easiest thing to do. That's what we did, and it's compliant because obviously they're very knowledgeable on this topic. Another challenge that we had, was it a challenge? It was a little bit of a challenge. So we signed up to Vivli. I was the person in charge of doing that. So I followed the directions, and it was like awaiting curation. I'm like, great, it's processing. And then a week goes by, and 2 weeks go by, and 1 month go by, and 2 months go by, and it's still awaiting curation. And so we heard from the HEAL stewards, like, hey, did you get a Vivli ID yet? Is it all set up? And we're like, no, it's in the system. After like 5 months or 4 months, I emailed Vivli and I'm like, hey, what's up with this? Should we have a Vivli ID yet? It seems like it's waiting on your end. And they're like, oops, well, there was a system loophole. Thank you for helping us discover this. And now we fixed it and you're all good to go. And that was true. They fixed it and it was good to go. My takeaway from this is, hey, if something's stuck, if you don't know something, ask them because they know about it. Next up, uncertainty about how to organize qualitative data. Because we have qualitative data. So we have a bunch of interviews and focus groups, and this is a transcript. So we have a text of all our interviews. What should we do with it? How should we upload it? We weren't sure. What we decided to do is just paste everything into one big Word document so that all our qualitative data, that's the raw data from the qualitative interviews that we have, it's all in one place. We weren't sure if that's the right thing to do. That's what we did. It seemed to be okay. We haven't heard otherwise. So it's a bit touch and go. You try, and if it works out, that's great. So that's what we did. And finally, Vivli project page doesn't, yes. So we uploaded the data from AIM-1. That went great. And now we also have AIM-2. So I'm like, oh, okay, now I need to, it's still the same study. I still need to upload a new batch of data. What do I do? And I wasn't able to enter the study. I wasn't even, when I logged into Vivli, there was, the circle of death. It's loading. And I just couldn't sign up. And it also took me like more than a month. And I thought the problem was in my computer. I switched computers, I switched browsers, I did everything. I wrote them. It says here in progress, actually, it's been resolved. They said, oh, well, they didn't use the word loophole, but they said, oh, our bad, we didn't grant you the rights that you need to do this. So you now have full rights to do this, and it's now resolved. And sure enough, I logged into Vivli, and now I have full rights. So this was resolved, which is great. Next slide, please. So if there's one takeaway message from this brief presentation, you're not alone. Consult with the HEAL data stewards and with your database support team. There was a lot of stuff that we weren't sure about. HEAL team was always there, always quick to respond, and super knowledgeable. And if you're having trouble with the database, write them. I wrote Vivli multiple times, and they solved the problem. I just regret that I waited like 3 months to write them each time, because the problem could have been solved pretty quickly. So speak out, and help is coming. That was our experience. And I believe that's it. So I'll turn it over to Valerie. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. You'll notice some themes in our presentation. So there's some similar experiences, but I'll dive right in. Next slide, please. So again, I'm Valerie Bradley. I'm project director for the HEAL Together study, and we have started the process of depositing our data in a domain-specific repository, and I'm going to walk you through that process from beginning to end. So as a brief overview, our study is an R61, R33 hybrid type 1 effectiveness implementation trial. It's part of the behavioral research to improve medication-based treatment program under principal investigator Dr. Jessica F. Magidson. It's a collaboration between the University of Maryland College Park and the University of Maryland, Baltimore. Our research focus is evaluating a behavioral activation intervention that's delivered by peer recovery specialists who are trained and specialized to support individuals in addiction treatment, and they've had their own lived experience with substance use and recovery. And we're seeking to see whether this intervention can support underserved minoritized individuals with OUD engaged in methadone treatment. So the outcomes we're looking at are the effectiveness of the intervention in supporting methadone treatment retention and persistence, as well as the implementation outcomes of the intervention, including feasibility, acceptability, fidelity, and adoption of the intervention. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. So first we asked ourselves, what repository do we use? And we had two questions that led us to our answer. The first is what types of data do we collect? So we collect human subjects data. It's longitudinal, it's multi-method. We have both quantitative portions, which are self-report, medical record, and biospecimen. And we have qualitative interviews and focus groups with patients and providers at the treatment center. So for this specific deposit, this is from our phase 1 R61 open label pilot, and we focused on the quantitative data side. We're currently working on the qualitative deposit and also gearing up for the data deposit for our current R33 randomized controlled trial. But for the quantitative portion of our open label pilot, we needed to find what repository was going to fit all of our data. So we next asked ourselves, is there a specific repository that's specific to NAHDAP studies that meets our needs? And the answer to that was yes. How do we know that? I'll walk you through this in the next slide. So as you might have seen earlier in this presentation, we did go to the HEAL compliant repository selection guide on the HEAL platform website. And we did use that filter for programs. We listed NAHDAP as the program and 2 options came up. We assessed both options and we ultimately determined that the NAHDAP repository was specific to our type of data, our study focus, and met all of our needs. I'll tell you a little bit more about that on the next slide. So NAHDAP is the National Addiction and HIV Data Archive Program. So they're focused on grant-funded research relating to drug addiction and HIV infection, particularly NAHDAP-funded grants. So this was a really great fit for us in particular. It is hosted by the University of Michigan Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, and it's funded by NAHDAP. So specifically, what components went into our data repository package? We had 6 components: our data sets, our data dictionaries, our code books, our consent forms, our IRB approval letter, and a list of the instruments we use to collect our data. Next slide, please. So I'd like to walk you through the approximate timeline of this process, at least what we went through. So that first month, as I said, we assessed our repository needs. We found the repository we were going to go forward with. We also made sure to review our data management and sharing plan to make sure that we are meeting all of the steps that we proposed that we would for this process. We reviewed all of the resources and guides that were provided by NAHDAP, and then we also needed to upload the metadata of our study to CEDAR as required by HEAL, and we registered our study on the HEAL platform, which became important later in the repository process. You'll see a little spinning clock behind this particular step. That's because this part did take us a little bit longer than the other parts. So I just wanted to highlight that this is something to prepare to spend a little time on. Little later in month 1, we went ahead and created an NAHDAP account, and we started becoming familiar with the platform that we were going to deposit our data in. And then moving into month 2, we actually began preparing our data sets. We ensured the data was complete, it was clean, and it was correctly labeled per HEAL CDEs. In month 3, we compiled the full package, loaded it up into the NAHDAP platform, and we hit submit. Around month 4, we started seeing these notifications from NAHDAP that our data set was under review for the initial review. A project officer reached out to us, let us know that they have gone through the first round of reviews, and they had a few follow-up questions. They wanted some clarifications, and they had some requests just to get a better sense of our data. So we responded to all those questions. And where we are now is we understand that our data is in the final review and curation process. I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. So overall, I kind of want to give you a sense of what we think is important to know in this process. First, a question that comes up a lot and came up for us was costs. For our particular situation, the curation and archiving costs are covered by NAHDAP. And it seems like this is especially particular to NIDA-funded studies in NAHDAP. So this is something that we were happy to hear. Now, I mentioned there were 2 stages of the review and curation process. I want to go into that final review part because it is important. Our data is currently under final review, and the really particular piece about that is the NAHDAP specialists are looking at whether our data is de-identified and if there are any sharing restrictions that we need to consider. That is a possibility, and so those are conversations that luckily the NAHDAP administrators are going to guide us through, so we're waiting to hear about those next steps. Generally, the expected timeline is for us, it's about 6+ months so far. So we'll see when we ultimately have our data published. NAHDAP does tell us that they will consider a specific date to have your data available if you request it. But generally, the whole process can be plus or minus a few months, depending on how complex your data package is. And lastly, our recommendations are definitely consult with the HEAL data stewards. They've been incredibly communicative and helpful throughout the process. We encourage you to establish points of contact at your chosen repository. And if you can, seek out repository-specific workshops and seminars. In June of this year, I traveled to the University of Michigan and I attended a NAHDAP workshop. And I actually met with a project officer who's overseeing our deposit. So it was a great opportunity to ask some questions, make that in-person contact. And we've maintained email communications ever since. And we get regular updates about the status of our deposit. So that's something we would highly recommend. That, I think, is all of it for now. And I'll pass it on to Sarah.
Thank you, Valerie. Here are some key takeaways from today's session. We have reviewed the minimum data sharing requirements for HEAL. We have explored resources and tools to help you select your HEAL compliant data repository tailored to your data study needs. We've gained some very valuable insights from 2 HEAL investigators on their experience with data depositions in different repositories. The very practical tips we received are extremely helpful, and we thank our 2 presenters for them. Please also remember that you are not alone. HEAL data stewards and repository support teams are available to assist you in every step of the way. So the HEAL data ecosystem support teams, which includes the HEAL platform team and the HEAL stewards, are here to help you meet your data sharing requirements. We hope that you will reach out to the stewards and to the platform team for any questions and support as you embark on your fair journey to maximize the value of HEAL data. In addition to the recording of today's presentation, we will email you a list of resources. This includes the slide deck And you can also find a link to our Slack channel and the Connect with Us form in the chat. Now we are going to move on to our next slide, where we will provide a brief description of how to utilize the Easy Retro board, which we will be diving into during the breakout rooms. So we will shortly stop the recording and transition into the breakout rooms. Please refer to the Easy Retro board located in the chat to see the types of questions that will be answered in each breakout room. Here's a brief guide on how to use an Easy Retro board. To add ideas, you'll click on the plus sign in the relevant column and fill out your idea. It will appear as a small card for others to comment on or to vote. So how can you comment on others' ideas? You can either upvote someone else's idea by using the thumbs up icon, or you can comment on the idea using the quote bubble icon. Next slide, please. In a moment, we will open the breakout rooms, and you will be able to select which breakout room with which you would like to attend. If you have any issues moving to a room, please put your desired room in the chat, and Chelsea Davis will ensure you get there. Once in your breakout rooms, the facilitator will provide more information on how they will function. If at any point you would like to switch breakout rooms, please come back to the main room, and the tutorial will staff will be there to help you to move into the room that you would like to move into. Please note that once we move into the breakout rooms, we are not going to be returning to this main room, and the tutorial will conclude from the breakout rooms. Your two options are Room A, which will be dealing with generalist repository questions and is designed for investigators who will be planning to deposit data into a generalist repository. Room B is the domain-specific repositories. This is tailored to investigators who have a specific repository that they need to deposit in, either due to their NIH funding institute or the type of data that they are creating. And with that, we will open up the breakout rooms.